To have you with us today.
Thank you,
Frank. It
Privilege
really
is
is.
mine.
Frank, can you just kind of open up, giving us a little idea of some of the different groups that you're involved with right now and what you see your call and role to be?
My personal background is that I had the privilege of working for President Reagan a lifetime ago in the Defense Department, and have more or less ever since been working on national security related issues, trying to promote what he used to call peace through strength as a philosophy and practice.
Yes. Didn't you receive a medal along that?
No, I got an award on my way out the door at the Pentagon.
There you go.
But the life's work, I guess you might call it, has been to try to protect our country, as I said an oath to do, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that has brought me into contact with a lot of wonderful people. Typically what we do at my organization, which I started about 30 years ago now, the Center for Security Policy, is build coalitions of like-minded individuals and other organizations to try to get things done to advance peace through strength,
bring
and
about
to
awareness,
help good people in government do the right thing, and to help counter what not so good people in government are doing that are not so helpful. And the single most important coalition I've ever been involved in is one that's relatively recently started in February, in fact, of last
17 or 18?
Winter, 2018.
Okay.
It's called the Save the Persecuted Christians Coalition. And its purpose is to try to pull together as many of those working in this battle space, if you will, this arena, to do something that complements and hopefully greatly increases the impact of lots of other people who are working to try to save persecuted Christians, kind of, if you will, at the retail level or symptomatically, you know, to get them food or water or medicine or clothing or shelter, all of which is incredibly important. And that's being done often very courageously by the kinds of organizations that are now part of our team. For example, Open Doors, for example. We've set as our particular goal as an organization, as a coalition, is to go at the problem systemically.
Okay.
In other words, to hold the persecutors accountable for what they're doing and to create disincentives to them for doing it. Right, costs, if you will. And you know, it's been such an amazing experience because as we have been doing this work, we've had the privilege of working with people in the Trump administration, good people in government like Sam Brownback and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, terrific people, and Mike Pence and the president himself are all very passionate. One manifestation of which, Mike Pompeo convened the first of what he calls ministerial meetings, that is to say, of his colleagues. He had 40 of his counterparts from other countries, like-minded countries, plus about 48 others that were represented at the ambassador level. So 88 countries came together to talk about religious freedom. And one of the most important pieces of it was, of course, the denial of religious freedom to, by the estimates of Open Doors, 215 million Christians. And the challenge for us is to say, okay, that's a horrific fact. We can try to apply bandages, but the patient's dying of cancer. We need to irradiate the cancer. So this coalition, Save the Persecuted Christians Coalition, started out inspired really by the experience that was miraculously successful, and I use that word advisedly, miraculously successful about 50 years ago. A handful of Jewish activists, initially in Cleveland, Ohio, decided that the persecution of another minority, Jews, inside what was then called the Soviet Union, desperately needed attention and corrective action. And at the time, of course, I'm fond of saying, Al Gore hadn't invented the internet. And the religious broadcasting mechanisms that we now admire so were relatively in their infancy. And most especially the government of the United States was at the time fully engaged in what they called détente.
Yes.
And the people who were in senior positions, President Nixon, President Ford, Henry Kissinger, didn't want any part of ruffling the feathers of the Soviet Union. So these guys did what they could, which was just to start putting up signs, mostly outside of synagogues, but some churches.
Endeavoring to bring about
all across the
awareness.
country, that simply said things like, save the persecuted Jews in the Soviet Union, or save Soviet Jewry, and the like. And a movement began as people became aware of this problem.
Just
and
raise the awareness.
decided that what they learned was, again, horrific and needed attention. People were being thrown in the gulags. People were being thrown into psychiatric wards. And,
it's not much
terribly
like
punished.
the slave whose back was seen in a photograph taken and sent throughout the land to effectuate the abolishment of slavery.
Raised awareness.
You have to bring awareness to these issues.
Right. Awareness is where it begins, and then motivating people to become engaged. And so what happened, just to finish that quick story, as those signs went up and as a political movement was born,
began to swell.
A guy that, as it happens, I subsequently went to work for, by the name of Henry Scoop Jackson, who was a United States Senator at the time from Washington State. He took this cause and he decided that what he was going to do was create leverage on the Soviets to create, just as we're talking about, accountability and costs for doing what they're doing. And the form that took was, he said to the Soviets, you're not going to get something it turned out they not only wanted, but they desperately needed, which was most favored nation status, preferential trade arrangements, which would have opened the door to investments and credit guarantees and technology transfer and all kinds of other benefits, financial safety net for that otherwise failing, bankrupt regime. And they wouldn't do what was required. Which was to let the Jews and anybody else who wanted to get out of the Soviet Union. They wouldn't do it. They didn't get most favored nation status. And about 4 or 5 years later, as they were teetering on the brink truly of collapse, another guy I had the privilege of working for, as I mentioned, Ronald Reagan, came along, and he used, among other instruments, economic warfare.
Mission Messiah Television is positive television to enhance your life. A true non-scripted reality show that features life lessons, unforgettable real-life success stories, and interviews with local heroes, national movers and shakers, and international celebrities, all united by their love for Jesus Christ. Mission Messiah Television gives real answers to life's toughest problems. It's positive television to enhance your life. Watch Mission Messiah Television today.
To take the Soviet Union down. And as a result, not only were millions of Jews released from the Soviet Union, but hundreds of millions of other people were freed from its tyranny.
Soviet bloc,
So if the Lord could do that miracle with this modest beginning, just a few signs out of synagogues, imagine what he could do with the cause of 215 million Christians,
persecuted Christians,
with the internet, with the religious broadcasting like this, with not least a very supportive administration from the top down. We believe, starting with a few signs, we can begin to build that movement and begin to make accountability and costs for persecutors apply in this case as well, to the great benefit not only of the hundreds of millions of Christians that are suffering, but of the world.
Absolutely. And I'm kind of jumping subjects on you here, but I know that it's another topic that's close to your heart, and I've listened to you speak, but that is basically, and it's the opposite of this, but it's the movement of Islam into America in this hour. And I come all the way back to reality again and understanding, and of course in our ministry, as we work with women and women with children, the first thing that we do initially is basically vet the person and understand what their heart is, because we have our parameters with which we have learned to work within, and if you are willing to work within those, then the Lord will work within you. Mm-hmm. If you're not, then this is not the place for you. And our Lord said it real clearly, didn't he, when he said, except we deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him, we will not enter into the kingdom. Mm-hmm. Well, is this really much different for us to desire to protect what we have, the Constitution we were given?
I think it's absolutely central to God's will that we preserve this country. I'm convinced that its creation and its extraordinary success over all these years has been a function of his blessings. And to the extent that we allow the mutation of what has been created based on God-given unalienable rights, right, we are at risk of not only losing his blessing, but losing the best hope for mankind. So I am completely convicted on this idea that we need to understand the inadvisability of bringing to this country more people
of open borders
who wish to
undermine,
change our country, especially in favor of what they call Sharia.
Yes.
Which, as you know, is a totalitarian political, military, legal doctrine and ideology that is absolutely antithetical to the Constitution of the United States. Absolutely. It does not tolerate, let alone revere and guarantee the God-given freedoms that we all too often take for granted.
I've heard you speak of the Hijra, mm-hmm, and basically how that functions and how far back it goes, even to Muhammad, I believe.
Mm-hmm. It does.
But can you explain to our audience a little bit about that work and
Sure.
how it is currently manifesting in this country in which you and I live and love?
Yeah. Sharia demands of its adherents that they impose it on everybody else. Muslim, by the way, mm-hmm, as well as non-Muslim.
Sharia demands a strict adherence to their philosophy.
Right, including its dominance worldwide.
Yes. Did you hear that? Including it is designed to dominate the world. That's the intent and purpose behind Sharia.
As you know, the literal meaning of the word Islam is submission.
Right.
And the idea of Sharia is to make everyone submit to Sharia and its program. To accomplish that, the faithful Muslim is told they must engage in jihad. And jihad can take various forms. Since 9/11 particularly, I think most Americans are
more aware, they've heard
of the violent kind of jihad,
yes,
which is the most efficient. It's the one that Muhammad himself practiced. It's the one that he encouraged everyone to practice, mm-hmm, because it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And the terror
strikes fear.
The terror by design.
The enemy of our soul is about striking fear.
Right. And the more terrified you are, the more fearful you are,
vulnerable,
the more you're likely to submit very quickly.
Yes.
Right, without resisting. What is also part of Sharia, though, is a recognition that where you cannot successfully use violence,
with force,
you're not strong enough.
Right.
You need to engage in other forms of jihad, one of which is the one you've mentioned, mm-hmm, which is a kind of demographic jihad, for want of a better term. Okay. That can take the form of just population growth at a rate that exceeds that of the non-Sharia adherent Muslim population. Right. Or it can take the form of bringing Sharia adherent Muslims to a place where they don't currently have dominance. That is what's known as the Hijra. And the first Hijra was, in fact, conducted by Muhammad himself when he went from a town in what is now Saudi Arabia, Mecca, to Medina. And his Hijra, his journey, was one in which he not only left one town to another, but he moved into the space of a warlord willing and able to use the violent jihad.
So he started on more of a stealth basis, underground,
relatively benign,
until he had permeated
and become strong enough to use the violent means. And then he went back to Mecca and enslaved the people there, forcing them into submission. But that's only one of the other techniques. Yet another is what I think of as kind of a financial jihad. We call it material support for terrorism, for example. And the faithful Muslim.
You mentioned the Sharia compliant financial mechanisms. Is that kind of?
There's a practice called zakat that is one of the pillars of Islam that you must. It's kind of a tax, really, more than a tithing as we think of in the Christian world. You are obliged to give a portion of your income to 8 prescribed purposes, at least one of which, and depending on how you define them, as many as 4
all Muslims,
are about
all
jihad.
Islam are expected to pay into this
to engage
set of 8
in zakat, and at least one, and perhaps as many as 4.
And this is whether they
involve jihad is the point. So it's not just that jihad is sort of out there and
That's
people
what I
do
was
it.
gonna say.
It is about
mild,
underwriting it.
Mild-mannered that we're speaking of, and then jihad, and we're making this huge separation, and yet this mild-mannered bunch are required to pay into
under Sharia
the support and underwrite.
That's correct.
Sharia jihad.
Now let me just say, I'm very strongly persuaded that not all Muslims want to live under Sharia or do, and certainly that not all want to impose it on us. Unfortunately, conservatively, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of them do, because they're told by their authorities of their faith, this is the true faith, that Islam and Sharia are one and the same.
Mission Messiah Television is positive television to enhance your life. A true non-scripted reality show that features life lessons, unforgettable real-life success stories, and interviews with local heroes, national movers and shakers, and international celebrities, all united by their love for Jesus Christ. Mission Messiah Television gives real answers to life's toughest problems. It's positive television to enhance your life. Watch Mission Messiah Television today.
The fourth kind of jihad, the violent kind, the demographic kind, the financial kind, and arguably the most insidious of them is something called civilization jihad. And that's what this group known as the Muslim Brotherhood has specifically been specializing in. The premise is that you must engage in jihad even when you're not strong enough to do it violently. The other technique is, as you were saying a moment ago, subversion, stealthy subversion. And you can take the form of hijra and financial, but it's also just penetration and influence operations.
Penetration, population.
And I will tell you, I think the single most effective line of attack of the civilization jihadis, bar none, is what is known as interfaith dialogue. The so-called bridge building that we see many good people of Christian or Jewish or other faiths engage in, on the premise that as long as we're all people of goodwill and faith, especially the great Abrahamic religions, we can make common cause and all will be well. Interestingly enough, one of the most influential figures in the Muslim Brotherhood pantheon is a fellow by the name of Sayyid Qutb, now dead, who wrote a book called Milestones. Not infrequently, when a jihadi is killed on the battlefield, there will be a copy of Milestones on him. One of the pieces of that which is relevant to this topic is a passage in which Qutb talks about bridge building. And he describes the chasm between Islam and its believers on the one hand and the infidels on the other,
Right.
as being so.
Because there's only one or the other in their perspective and mindset.
But the chasm between them, he said, is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it, except for the purpose of bringing the unbeliever to Islam. In other words, when you hear these imams, or you hear priests and pastors and rabbis saying, well, we're all about bridge building, it's a one-way bridge as far as the Muslim practitioners are concerned.
I pray you heard what my brother said, and you've studied this for some time, Frank.
I have.
But that bridge is a one-way bridge, and we need to be extremely cautious of engagement in that dialogue.
An uninformed, albeit, well-meaning engagement is enabling the penetration and subversion of institutions,
Permeation.
including the faith community, that are central to our defenses against this kind of attack.
And that's one of the things that we have learned over time. When we veer from truth, we're in trouble. And so therefore, it's imperative that we train ourselves in the truth of God's Word so that we can see clearly, so that we're not blinded into compromise the truth upon which we are to stand.
Right. And what makes this vastly more complicated is that, unlike our faith and most others, under Sharia, the practice of lying for the faith is not simply condoned, it's obligatory.
Yes.
If it is necessary to the advance of the faith.
Words, it's expected.
Yeah.
You're expected to lie.
It's called taqiyya in Arabic.
Taqiyya?
Taqiyya.
Taqiyya.
And it is a well-honed instrument of advancing the
cause.
Jihad against those who are
Considered infidel.
naive enough
To believe it.
or simply uninformed. And so your point about the truth is important in two respects. We need to be steeled by it on the one hand, and we need to understand that they use what Churchill used to call the bodyguard of lies against our truth. One of the things that I'm prayerful of is as we work to promote an understanding of what's happening to the faith elsewhere, by, among other things, getting banners like this put up outside of churches and synagogues, much as the Soviet Jewry campaign did in the years past. We can begin helping people, not only inside those churches, but also driving by them, ask themselves, why aren't those banners out front of every church?
Amen.
And it begins to a thought process that says, what's going on inside those churches, which may not be as rooted in the truth and the faith.
That's really good, and it goes back to, I think, even before we began the interview, we talked about Bozell and the Media Research Center and what he warned us of that night in that little special gathering of what the uptick they have seen in the last 3-4 months with persecution right here in the homeland of Christians, of believers, but a silencing.
Well, among others, I think what Brent is onto, and I'm frankly a case in point, is the silencing of people who are saying things that is deemed to be inconsistent
Adverse.
with
The left policy.
the leftist agenda and or the Islamists. I call it the red of the Islamists, of the left, the green of the Islamists, the red-green axis. This is now manifesting itself on Google and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Amazon and so on. This is part of the
our
war
reality
being waged against
and
us.
that's, I love your picture because again, if the church doesn't realize this is at the doorstep.
Right.
This is at the doorstep.
It is. If it's not
And
actually
if we
inside.
don't, if we don't, and what you're saying and what we're kind of agreeing on, some of it's inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we better understand the time.
Right.
in the
I'll just
essence.
explain this symbol, which is in the middle of some of the banners. We've got a new logo as well, but this is a symbol that is an Arabic letter.
Mm-hmm, I thought.
The Arabic letter N, which is the first letter, of course, of the word Nazarene,
Okay.
which is used as sort of a curse word in the Muslim Sharia community. This symbol was painted on the doors of Christians in Iraq before ISIS removed them from their property for the purposes of raping, selling them into slavery, crucifying them, what have you, and stealing their property. So it's a powerful sort of indication of the worst of what's happening now in parts of the world. Let me just introduce your listeners to this one other product that the Save the Persecuted Christians is making available now. This is an image, by the way, of a woman whose husband was among the 21 Christians murdered on the beach in Libya by ISIS a few years ago. The People of the Cross exhibit is an effort we're making to do exactly what we're talking about here, which is to bring the truth of what's happening to 215 million Christians around the world to the widest possible audience. And what we've done here is we've put together a series of banners that talk about country after country after country in which these people are being horrifically brutalized. This is arguably the most traumatizing of the exhibit. Look at that little girl.
I see that.
7 years old, perhaps, weeping with this jihadist with his arm around her because she's now his property. And even girls younger than she are being subjected to this, and untold numbers of them. And so you look through this and you realize that in country after country, horrors are being inflicted on these people. And the point is not simply to point this out, it's to move people to act. And what we'd like to encourage people to do, if they're interested, is to get in touch with us at savethepersecutedchristians.org and order this exhibit.
That's what you're asking us to do.
Amen.
Begin crying out for these 215 million persecuted believers.
Amen.
What a blessing.
Thank you.
Look
And
forward
you
to
are too.
working with you.
Thank you. Me too.